We move to another passage of Scripture this morning. We begin a new series of messages from the book of Exodus. And so we begin in Exodus chapter 1 with verse 1. It says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his own household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all of his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and they grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, 'Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land.' Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities of Pithom and Ramses, but they were more oppressed. And the more they multiplied, and the more that they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and they made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and bricks, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. And the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew wives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other was Puah, 'When you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women, and you see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, she shall live.' But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, 'Why have you done this, and let the male children live?' And the midwives said to Pharaoh, 'Because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them.' So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. And the Pharaoh commanded all of his people, 'Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you should let every daughter live.'" As we look at Exodus chapter 1, quick question. We're thinking about a new series of messages called Get Me Out of Here. To be honest with you, anybody in the last 7 days find themselves in a circumstance or a situation where you just kind of said under your breath, "Get me out of here right away"? This moment doesn't count, and I hope this isn't one of those moments. But get me out of here. I've got to go. Maybe it was an awkward conversation. Maybe it was some kind of painful experience. Maybe it was even a physical kind of pain. Maybe it was a situation at work that you just kind of thought, there is no success here. There is no way for this to turn out well. Maybe it was a hardship, a challenge, a pressure that is on your life where you just said, "Get me out of here, please." If you didn't have that kind of experience just once in this last week, the law of averages do not look good for next week. I'm just going to tell you that right now. If you didn't have that last week, buckle up. I don't know what's coming this coming week. But we do find ourselves in some of those places, and sometimes what we're talking about here is just thin. This is just awkward. I don't want to be here. I hope this ends. Get me out of here. But there are other times and there are other experiences that we have that run deep. And sometimes our cry and our call that says, "Please get me out of this situation, this circumstance," runs as deep as the hurt and the pain and the difficulty that we're talking about. I'm really believing that this series of messages could speak deeply into our lives in this season. Because I think that we do all have these moments where we say, I've got to get out of here. Something has got to change. Something has got to dramatically be rearranged in my life if I'm going to survive these days. And there's probably no part of the Bible that deals with hardship quite like the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus is all about hard, unfair, unjust, difficult, painful, agonizing kind of experiences. In fact, you probably noticed it in the book, particularly in chapter 1, verses 11 through 14. One of the things that we see is, the thing that struck me is the intensity of some of the things that the people of Israel are dealing with in this chapter. Just if you pick it up here in verses 11 and following, it talks about heavy burdens. It talks about being oppressed. It talks about the relationships being so broken that the people are in dread of them. It talks about the people around them dealt ruthlessly with them. It says that they made their lives bitter with some of the hard things that they had to face. And then it comes back again and says people dealt with them ruthlessly. Those are all intense words. It didn't say it was a tough time, it was a bad day. It says that their lives had been filled and become bitter. And I wanted to say that bitter is almost a technical word about the kind of life that you taste and you almost choke as you breathe. This isn't just having a bad attitude. This is an external surrounding of you that says, this is too much to handle. And so every once in a while, we'll come to a place and we'll find ourselves when we cry, get me out of here. But I want you to know that there is a way out. I want you to know that whatever it is that you carried in this morning, there is a way out. In fact, one of the things that I'm excited to tell you about and help you to see this morning is to see this morning is that the very word Exodus means the way out. The whole book not only describes the hardships that they faced, but in the title of the book, it says, there is a way out. And so I want to tell you, and I want to encourage you, and I want to remind you that despite the difficulty that you might be facing in this hour, there is a way out. Now, what we're going to see in this book is that we're going to see sometimes that the way out isn't the way out that we thought it was going to be. Sometimes it takes longer than we think it's going to take. And sometimes it surprises us from beginning to end. But I want you to know the hand of God is at work. And there is a way out from the hardship, the difficulties, the ruthlessness, the bitterness that sometimes that we find our lives in. So let's unpack it a little bit and see what it is that God teaches us. The passage almost begins with a surprise. Because one of the first things that I see when I take a look at this passage of Scripture is that your comfort may be deceiving. You see, before we can talk about hardships, before we can talk about difficulties, before we can talk about life being bitter, we have to recognize that sometimes the very things that we consider to be comforts aren't nearly as comfortable as we think that they should be. Now, let's take just a look at this passage and take a look at this situation. It begins with the fact that the people of Israel felt really, really good. In fact, if you look at verses 6 and 7, there is, again, another string of words that talk about how great the people of Israel are doing. It tells us that they were fruitful, that they increased greatly, that they multiplied, that they grew exceedingly strong, and that the land was filled. In fact, they had started as a group of 70 people. And now there were almost too many people to be counted. And you could almost see them looking around and feeling their strength, looking around and saying, look how blessed we are. Look how great things are going. And in fact, you could almost hear them saying to one another, check us out. Look how strong we are. Well, what happened is that somebody did check them out. And somebody did look at how strong they were. And they said, whoa, this is not a good thing. That the Egyptians who were hosting the people of Israel looked around and said, wow, that is a ton of them. They're growing every day. If there was ever a war, we would have this group inside of us that would rise up against us, and we'd be fighting people from outside. We'd be fighting people from inside. We've got to do everything we can to get rid of these people. And so almost it feels like, as you read the text, almost overnight, it goes from being, man, life is great. Look how strong we are. Look how we have all of these things put together. To all of a sudden, the entire government, the entire culture of people, all of their circumstances is turned upside down to make their life miserable. Now, before we go a whole lot deeper, we kind of just have to give ourselves just a little bit of context as to how we got to Exodus chapter 1. We're going to back up just a little bit for just a moment. And what we get to is you have Abraham, who is the first of the called people, the first people to receive the promise. Abraham has a son named Isaac. Isaac has a son named Jacob. Jacob really gets to it, and he has 12 sons. Now, one of those sons wasn't quite as popular as the other sons. My brothers understand that. One of the sons wasn't quite as popular as the rest of them. In fact, they didn't just dislike him, they hated him. They didn't just hate him. What they did is they sold him into slavery into a far, far away country. Joseph is his name, and he ends up in Egypt. And it seems like every time something goes right for Joseph, something else goes wrong. And so he has a little bit of success, and then the bottom drops out. A little bit of success, and the bottom drops out. A little bit of success, and the bottom drops out. But God's hand is upon Joseph's life all of that time. And God begins to move him and place Joseph into places until Joseph has a dream. And because he has proximity to Pharaoh through strange course of events, he tells Pharaoh, man, have I got good news for you. You are about to have the 7 best years that you have ever seen in your life. Anybody would like to have a prophecy like that over their life? Man, you are about to have the 7 best years of your life. Pharaoh's like, I like this guy. This guy's great. And then Joseph says, and the 7 best years of your life are going to be followed by the 7 worst years of your life. And just as much, everything grows, everything flourishes, everything is blessed, everything is successful for 7 years. The next 7 years are going to be famine and drought, and everything is going to fail. Pharaoh says, well, what do we do? Joseph says, well, if I were you, I would use those 7 great years to prepare for the 7 hard years. Pharaoh says, that's the plan, you're in charge. He puts Joseph as the second most important person in all of Egypt, which really makes him basically the second most important person in the entire world. Then the story gets interesting. Because this famine that Joseph was talking about was not just an Egypt problem. It expands to the entire region, going all the way back to where his family's from. All the way back to the land of Canaan. And the famine begins to impact his family. And his family is now experiencing the difficulty of the drought and no food. And Joseph's father says to the brothers, rumor has it, they've got food in Egypt. Go buy some food in Egypt. The brothers do what they're told. They arrive in Egypt. They got to see a man about some food. Guess who the man is? It's the man that they sold into slavery. They don't recognize him at first. And there's a whole lot of story that goes on there. But they do have a beautiful reunion. Joseph forgives them and says, listen, what you intended for harm, what you intended for evil, God has turned into good. In fact, Joseph says, listen, we're not done with this famine. You don't need some bags of grain. You need to be someplace where the grain comes from. So go get Dad. Go get your families. Go get everybody. And stay here. And you will be safe here. And so really 70 people stay in that place. Now, the thing about it is, I don't know how many years into the famine they already were, but the famine is supposed to be 7 years long. It's 400 years later, and they are still living in Egypt. Years ago, when I was in seminary, I pastored a church up in the woods of Washington Parish. Driving home one Wednesday night by myself, my car broke down. This was back at the time when the only person who had a car phone, that's what they would call it, a car phone, was the President of the United States. That's the only person that had a car. So I had to go knock on somebody's door. And I had to go ask for some help. And so this lady that I'm sure did not want to find some stranger in her front step after dark and stuff like that, kid, showing up. I said, I'm a pastor. I don't know if that helped or made things worse. But she let me in. I needed to use her phone. I needed to call a tow truck. I needed to tell Susan, I'm alive, but you're not going to see me anytime soon. But she was really, really, really nice. In fact, we sat down and we watched the NBA Finals, Michael Jordan against Charles Barkley. It's a great game. Enjoyed watching it. She was a rescue moment for my life. It was great. I'm so grateful for her. But if I never left the kitchen, if I never left her house, if all of these years later I was still camping out in her kitchen, that wouldn't be right. It would mean that I had forgotten about my relationship with Susan. It would have meant that I'd forgotten about the promises, the call of God on my life. It would have forgotten about everything past. And I just said, because I like this kitchen, because I found this kitchen to be a safe place, because in this moment this was a right place for me to be, I'm staying here forever. Would have been a huge mistake. This is a 7-year famine, and they're on year 400 and something. What happened is Joseph set them up in a good spot, and they got comfortable. They got comfortable, and they said, why would we go back to our old life? Joseph's a big deal here. Well, we get taken care of here. He's a hero here. Let's just live off of this. And they never went back home. You know what was happening back home? The Canaanites were continuing to grow. The Canaanites began to build cities. They began to put walls around their cities and made great cities, cities like Jericho, that one day the Israelites were supposed to go back to and take possession of that land. But now that land is so much harder to take possession of because they've been absent. And their enemies have been building cities and building walls that they're going to eventually have to tear down. I kind of wonder, if you look at verses 6 and 7, where it talks about how they increased and they multiplied and they filled the land and they were blessed. What if all of that had been happening in Canaan instead of in Egypt? The land would have been theirs. They wouldn't have had to tear down and defeat these cities. They would have possessed the land just because the blessing of God was upon them. But instead, they were distracted. In fact, they were ready to forfeit their inheritance for the piece of property that they had a lease on. God says, this is going to be yours forever. But they're like, yeah, but this is ours for now. And they exchange the now. I want you to know that it's possible when we talk about hardship that the biggest problem in your life isn't the hardship that you're facing. It's the comfort that you're facing. Because there's a calling, a commitment, a promise that God has put on your life that you have forgotten about because you've gotten comfortable in the status quo, in the what's normal, it's in what everyone else is doing. And you have forgotten about who you are and where you're supposed to be. Your comforts may be deceiving. So before you even get to your troubles, it may be your comforts or your difficulty. But I would also tell you that your hardships might be strategic. Your hardship might be strategic. Now, there's a little bit of debate as whether I'm right about how long the Israelites were supposed to be there or not. God, in fact, speaks to Abraham, the first person of the promise, and says, listen, I'm going to give you all of these blessings and all of these things and all of this land. He says, even though your people will spend 430 years in slavery, I will bring them up. Now, I believe that was God's promise to redeem a broken situation, not saying that they had to stay there for 430 years. I think God was saying, I can fix it even when they get off the path. But either way, we're on the other side of 400 years, and nobody's packing a suitcase. I mean, nobody is saying, well, God told Abraham 400 years. That's coming up right now. We should start having some packing parties. We should start thinking about the best path that we're going to take to get out of here. It never crossed their mind. In fact, I think one of the things that is a really detrimental thing in this moment is that if you look at the story of what we call the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, those are stories of people encountering God day by day. And that they were hearing from God, speaking to God. God would come and visit. Jacob even physically wrestled with God. God was that close in their lives. But in Egypt, it's comfortable. Oh, and they also haven't heard from God in 400 years. And I don't know if anybody had even noticed. I don't know if anybody was brokenhearted. I don't know if anybody was saying, I cannot believe we haven't heard from God. Let's stop everything that we're doing. Let's fall on our knees. Let's wait to hear from God. God, why haven't you visited us just like you did Jacob and Isaac and Abraham? I don't hear any of that in the text. You see, it tells us that there arose a Pharaoh who did not remember, did not know Joseph. I would tell you the people had forgotten Joseph and the God of Joseph as well. It wasn't just Pharaoh that had forgotten. The people had forgotten. And so, because God loves them, He has to awaken them. He has to stir them. He has to call them. He has to bring them back to life so that they will hunger and look for Him and wait for Him and depend on Him once again. You ever have to wake somebody up that's a heavy sleeper? I think one day our house may burn down. And we will be at the emergency room and they'll be treating us. And they'll look at me and say, we got to take an x-ray. Your arm is broken. I said, did you break your arm in the fire? No, I broke my arm with Susan trying to wake me up. Some people are hard to wake up. The people of God had been asleep for 4 centuries. They had forgotten to call on Him, look for Him, expect Him. And so He is going to have to do some things to wake them up. And what happens is He allows these hardships and these difficulties to come upon their life. Not because He doesn't love them, but because He does love them so that they will wake up again. I would say, and I want to be careful here, I'm not saying that every hardship that you're facing is a good thing. I'm not saying that every hardship that you're facing is even from God, but I will tell you that God can use it. And it may be that you're not just supposed to escape that hardship, but you are supposed to wake up in that hardship to the presence and the calling of God on your life. And one of the mistakes that we make is to try to run away from hardship without letting God strategically move our lives and bring us back to where we're supposed to be. One more thing I want to look at. Your comfort may be deceiving. Your difficulties may be strategic. And I would also tell you that your rescue may be surprising. There's a crisis in Exodus chapter 1. There's a real problem in Exodus chapter 1. There's these hardships, and the hardships come with the slavery and the abuse and the ruthlessness. And then it even extends and says, listen, we're going to try to exterminate every male child. Exodus chapter 1 needs a hero. Exodus chapter 1 needs someone who will stand up and rescue the day. If you were to walk through Goshen, if you were to walk through there and say, I wonder who is going to be the hero of this hour, I don't think you would have come up with midwives first. Unless you looked at the back of the book and found the answer key. I don't think you would have looked at midwives. I think the midwives were probably one of the most overlooked population groups in the land. People didn't really value that role. A lot of times people were midwives because they didn't have children of their own. If they didn't have children of their own, that must mean something was wrong with them. God hadn't blessed them. Something wasn't right. And so I think people looked right past midwives all the time, right over the midwives. It's possible that they looked past themselves. But you know what? When the crisis comes, you know who is in perfect place to bring rescue? It's the midwives. Overlooked by everybody. And yet, God saw them and said, I will use them to begin the rescue of my people. I want you to know that God is sending and has sent midwives into your life to begin the rescue of your life from the hard places and the hard things. You may not even notice them because they're overlooked, but God has strategically placed them into your life. Your presence in this service this morning may be a midwife moment because He has placed this word, this truth into your life right now at the very moment you need to hear it. Who would have guessed? The midwives. But you know what? I think God knew what He was doing. Okay, I know that God knew what He was doing. But you know what midwives do? They assist in deliverance. They assist in the delivery. And here they are. They are going to help the deliverance of Israel in this moment. It is possible that you have been strategically placed to help with the delivery and the deliverance of someone else in the hardship they're facing. Now, you may be overlooked by others. You may be overlooked by many. In fact, you may overlook yourself when you look in the mirror. But it's quite possible that God has placed you strategically in a specific spot because you're going to bring about the deliverance of somebody else. That's a promise for your life. So what does this mean for us this morning? What's the application for us this morning? Well, I just wonder. I just want to inventory some comfort. Is it possible that there's some comfort that's in your life that's there because you've exchanged that comfort for a promise or a calling or a commitment of God, and you've set that aside because it was just easier to settle into other parts of your life? And so I just want you to take that inventory. Is your comfort today, is it present because you've set aside some calling or commitment or a promise of God, that you have stayed someplace that maybe was the right place for you to be, but you weren't supposed to stay there 400 years. You were supposed to be there for that moment. It was a rescue for that moment, but you're supposed to move past that and reclaim those promises and those commitments and those callings in your life. Is it possible that you need to remember a calling or a commitment or a promise? And if you are in the midst of a hardship or a difficulty, and I mean a heavy one, I want you to know that the midwife is on his way. I want you to know that even when life isn't working, God is. God is. And He has that means of deliverance already selected, already commissioned, and already sent into your life. You may not see, you may not feel it yet, but help is already on the way.